January 7, 1969. A Harvard scholar found dead in her own bed, her body covered in red dust. For 55 years, no one knew who killed her, until one strand of DNA finally spoke. Somewhere down the narrow lanes near Harvard Square, a young man pressed gloved fingers against a doorframe that should have been locked. James Holloway had climbed 4 flights of groaning wooden stairs to apartment 4B of 6 University Road. The building was a crooked relic of the 1920s, flaking paint, broken mailboxes, and a scent of mildew that never quite left its hallways. That morning, Jane Britton had missed the most important exam of her doctoral life. She'd missed every call, every knock, every reason James could think of for her to still be asleep had already slipped away. He turned the knob. It moved easily. Inside, the light was thin and gray, leaking through half-frozen windows. A fur coat lay spread over the bed. Beneath it, a shape. Jane. Silence. A faint hiss from the radiator. James stepped closer. He reached for the coat, then stopped. His chest felt hollow. He backed into the hallway and pounded on his neighbor's door. Jill Mitchell answered, startled by the look on his face. "Something's wrong with Jane," he said. "Please just come." When they re-entered the apartment, Jill crossed the floor first. The fur coat was heavy with damp. She lifted it. She screamed. Blood soaked the pillow. Jane's nightgown had been pulled over her head. Her auburn hair, matted dark. The walls and ceiling shimmered with a fine red dust that caught the light like rust. For a moment, James couldn't move. His breath came in short, tearing sounds. Jill ran for the phone. The receiver shook in her hands as she called the Cambridge police. Outside, sirens broke the winter stillness. Inside, time stopped. Detectives arrived within minutes. The apartment became a frozen tableau of questions. A broken door lock, a bed that looked staged, and that strange red powder clinging to every surface. Later it would be identified as red ochre, the same mineral once used in ancient Persian burial rituals. A discovery that would twist the investigation for decades. That night, under the sickly glow of corridor lights, reporters gathered on the street. The name Jane Britton began its long descent into the city's lore. A brilliant archaeologist murdered on the eve of her future, her death marked by symbols no one understood. For 55 years, the question of who killed her would outlive nearly everyone who asked it. Only a handful of photographs, a few boxes of evidence, and a rumor about red dust would remain. Until one strand of DNA, half a century later, whispered the truth she could never speak. To understand what was lost that winter night, you have to know who Jane Britton was. Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1969 was a city divided by time. Half of it lived in ivy-covered halls where the world's brightest minds debated history. The other half lingered in smoky bars, where music and protest drowned out tradition. Somewhere between those worlds was Jane, a young woman who believed she could bridge the ancient and the modern simply by studying what humans leave behind. She was 23, the daughter of scholars. Her father, J. Boyd Britton, was an administrator at Radcliffe College. Her mother, Ruth, a medieval historian who filled their house with maps, books, and the smell of ink and tea. Jane had grown up surrounded by the weight of ideas, and from the moment she could hold a brush, she painted the past. Her friends said she was the kind of student who smiled at difficulty, the kind who studied until dawn, then still made time to help others review their notes. She wasn't loud or rebellious. She was curious, endlessly curious, the way archaeologists are about the people long gone. After graduating magna cum laude from Radcliffe in 1967, she did what few women of her time dared to do. She went into field archaeology. That summer, she joined an expedition in the deserts of southeastern Iran under Professor C.C. Lambert-Karlovsky. There, among sand and wind, she found what she'd been searching for: pieces of the world before memory, pottery shards etched with forgotten patterns, fragments of human effort still echoing thousands of years later. One artifact fascinated her more than any other: a stone blade, smooth on one side, sharpened by ancient hands on the other. She wrapped it carefully in linen and brought it home to Cambridge. To her, it wasn't just a souvenir. It was a reminder that the past could survive anything: time, sand, even death itself. When she returned to the States in late '68, she moved into the fourth-floor apartment at 6 University Road, a narrow, aging building wedged between bookstores and bakeries. The rent was cheap. The paint peeled from the walls. The fire escape rattled in the wind. But to Jane, it was enough. A quiet place to read, paint, and prepare for her doctoral exams. She shared the space with a turtle, a cat, and her collection of artifacts. On her walls hung watercolors of desert ruins and sketches of pottery fragments. The stone blade rested on a shelf beside her desk, where she worked late into the night. Her life followed the rhythm of academia. Breakfast at 8, lectures at 9, research until dark. Dinner with classmates, study groups, ice skating on Cambridge Common in winter, and always studying. To her colleagues, she was a prodigy. To her boyfriend, James Holloway, she was a mystery. Brilliant yet reserved, kind yet distant, as though she already lived half in another time. They were both anthropology students. They spent long nights debating cultural theory, arguing over excavation reports, sharing sandwiches in Harvard's libraries. He once said she looked at the world like she was deciphering it. By January 1969, Jane was at the top of her class. The general examinations were only days away, the final step before she could begin her PhD dissertation. Her professors expected perfection. Her friends expected celebration. But Jane had begun to notice things she couldn't explain. Footsteps in the hallway outside her apartment late at night. The sound of her door latch shifting when no one was there. A shape she thought she saw through her frosted window. Gone the moment she turned the light on. She told her landlord the lock was broken. He promised to fix it. He never did. Still, Jane refused to move. She told friends she'd be gone soon anyway, to a better apartment once exams were over. For now, she'd make do. In the evenings, she painted or wrote letters to her mother. Ruth Britton kept every one. In her final letter, dated January 4th, 1969, Jane wrote, "I think of you whenever I look at the stars above Cambridge. They seem so much older here, as though they've seen too many stories and forgotten which ones ended happily." 3 days later, those same stars would hang above a crime scene that defied explanation. January 6th, 1969, the first day back after Harvard's winter break. Snow drifts lined the curbs of Cambridge Common, and the lamps along Massachusetts Avenue burned through a low, pale fog. Jane's morning began like every other. Coffee, a notebook, a half-written essay on Near Eastern burial customs. She spent the day with her anthropology classmates, going over notes for the general examinations. They met at a small restaurant just off Harvard Square, the kind of place where students linger for hours, talking about history and dreams over cups of burnt coffee. When she left, the temperature had dropped below freezing. The snow crunched beneath her boots. She changed clothes back at her apartment, fed her cat, and met up with James Holloway to go ice skating. It was one of her favorite things. They skated under flickering streetlights, their laughter echoing against the cold air. To James, she seemed happy, tired but hopeful. The exams were only a few hours away. Around 10:30 p.m., they returned to her apartment. They sat on the floor with their notes, talking about archaeology and the dig in Iran. Jane mentioned how she missed the desert nights. The quiet, the stars, the way history felt alive there. James left around 11:30 p.m. He had to rest for the exam the next morning. Jane walked him to the door. He kissed her goodnight. Neither of them knew it would be their last conversation. Around 12:30 a.m., Jane went down the hall to her neighbors, Donald and Jill Mitchell. The couple was still awake, watching television. They offered her a glass of sherry. She laughed about the upcoming test, about how nervous everyone was. Jill later said Jane seemed calm, maybe even too calm. She left their apartment a little after 12:45 a.m. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. What happened between 1 o'clock and 2 a.m. would become one of Massachusetts' most haunting mysteries. The fire escape outside Jane's window led straight down to the street. The door to the building had no working lock. Anyone could enter, climb, and vanish again without being seen. Somewhere in that hour, someone did. A stranger, or perhaps not a stranger, pushed open her window. The snow on the sill melted into fingerprints. Inside, the air was warm from the radiator, the smell of paint and paper thick in the dark. Jane had already changed into her nightgown. She may have heard the creak of metal. She may have turned. But the blow came fast. A single strike, then another, and another. When the police arrived hours later, they found the room in chaos. Overturned books, shattered glass, blood on the sheets. The medical examiner later wrote, "Multiple fractures to the skull, cause of death, blunt force trauma." The weapon was never found, but one object was missing. The stone artifact from Iran, the one with the sharpened edge. Gone. On the wall and across her body, investigators noticed a fine red powder, like iron dust. It coated her nightgown, her skin, even the ceiling above her bed. It wasn't paint. It wasn't rust. It was red ochre. When professors from the anthropology department were brought in to assist, one of them whispered something that would change everything. Red ochre is used in ancient Persian burial rituals. The police seized on it immediately. A ritual killing. An archaeologist murdered with her own artifact, her body covered in a substance once used to honor the dead. It was as if history itself had turned against her. The newspapers devoured the story. Harvard student slain in ancient burial rite. One headline read. Another, mystery ritual killing in Cambridge. Students gathered outside the building, whispering about curses and cults. Professors refused interviews. And behind closed doors, detectives drew up lists of classmates, of teachers, of anyone who'd ever studied the Near East. For days, cameras flashed outside 6 University Road. Inside, the apartment remained sealed off, marked only by yellow tape and silence. When Jane's parents arrived, the police wouldn't let them enter. Her mother, Ruth, stood in the snow outside and whispered, "She studied the dead, and now she's become one of them." It wasn't just murder that chilled the city that week. It was what the red dust seemed to say, that maybe the past isn't always buried. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it comes for those who dare to uncover it. The investigation into Jane Britton's murder began before dawn on January 7, 1969. By sunrise, 6 University Road looked like a fortress. Police cars lined the street. Reporters gathered under falling snow. Inside, detectives moved carefully through the apartment, measuring, photographing, collecting. Each movement echoed against the narrow walls. Detective Sergeant James Sullivan led the case. A quiet man, methodical. He'd seen dozens of homicides before, but none like this. He stared at the red powder scattered across the room and muttered, "What kind of person does this?" The first theory came quickly, the ritual theory. The red ochre, the missing artifact, the victim's field of study. It was too coincidental. By noon, the words ancient burial rite appeared in every news headline. Cameras caught students huddled under umbrellas, whispering. A Harvard professor told a journalist, she may have known her killer, someone from her own department. The pressure on police intensified. The Cambridge police called in Massachusetts State Police for assistance. Soon, more than 30 officers were working the case. The first was the one closest to her, James Holloway, her boyfriend. He was calm during questioning, maybe too calm. He admitted being with her the night before. He described the ice skating, the sherry, the goodbye. He'd gone home by midnight, he said. Neighbors confirmed seeing him arrive. He passed a polygraph test. Still, suspicion lingered. Next, detectives interviewed Donald and Jill Mitchell, the neighbors who'd last seen her alive. Both took lie detector tests and passed. No motive, no evidence. Cleared. Attention turned to the anthropology department at Harvard. Jane had been part of a close academic circle. Her professors were giants in their field, men who'd built reputations excavating the ancient world. But even among scholars, envy and rivalry existed. The media speculated wildly. Could obsession with ancient rituals have turned deadly? Detectives questioned over 100 people connected to the department, professors, graduate students, even janitors. They collected fingerprints, handwriting samples, class rosters. Nothing fit. The red ochre, once thought to be ceremonial, became the investigation's curse. Professor Lambert Karlovsky, Jane's expedition leader in Iran, dismissed the theory entirely. He told police, "There are no Persian burial rites involving ochre. Someone misunderstood archaeology." But the damage was done. The public had already decided Jane's death was ritual. And once the public names a ghost, it's hard to convince them it isn't real. The investigation dragged into February. A grand jury was convened, unusual for a homicide so soon, but detectives feared suspects would leave for overseas fieldwork. Every major anthropology student was questioned. Each denied involvement. Each was released. Then came a chilling coincidence. 6 years earlier, another woman, Beverly Sammons, had been murdered in the same building, strangled in her apartment. Her killer confessed as part of the Boston Strangler cases. But now people wondered, had he acted alone? Could a copycat have returned? The press revived the legend of the Strangler. For weeks, fear swept Cambridge. Students locked their doors. Women moved out of the old building. One newspaper headline read, "Harvard haunted again," and then nothing. No new evidence. No new suspects. Just silence. By summer, the Britton case was ice. The laboratory reports were inconclusive. No weapon was found. No fingerprints matched. Every lead dissolved into speculation. Detectives quietly moved on to other crimes. Jane's parents held a memorial service that autumn. Her mother spoke softly, her words trembling through the church. She believed the past could speak if you listened long enough. "I pray one day, someone will listen for her." Afterward, the Brittons packed Jane's belongings into boxes. Books, letters, sketches, the tiny artifacts she'd once loved. The missing stone blade was never recovered. The boxes were sealed and stored away. Years passed. The world moved on. Cambridge changed. The old building at 6 University Road was renovated, then renamed. Students who lived there afterward never knew what happened in apartment 4B. Detective Sullivan retired in 1985. He kept one photo of the scene in his desk: the red dust, the untouched notebook, the half-drunk cup of coffee. He used to tell younger officers, "Some cases don't end. They just stop being loud." And so it was. For half a century, the murder of Jane Britton became a whisper in Cambridge's long memory. A story professors told to warn students about walking alone at night. A headline in the archives. A question mark in the city's history. But time, like archaeology, has layers. And beneath the dust of decades, something still waited. Something small enough to fit on the edge of a microscope slide, and powerful enough to rewrite everything. For 50 years, the truth slept inside a sealed envelope, inside a box, inside a room no one remembered, until the science Jane loved became the very thing that found her justice. For nearly 5 decades, the murder of Jane Britton was frozen in time, sealed inside dusty files, whispered about in Harvard's halls, but never solved. The detectives were gone. The witnesses aged. Even the reporters who once flooded Cambridge Square had long retired. But science doesn't forget. It waits quietly, patiently, until the world catches up. In 2018, a small division of the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab began a new initiative, retesting cold cases from the 1960s and 70s using modern forensic genealogy. Each file was a story waiting for an ending. Each envelope, a voice waiting to be heard. One of those envelopes carried a simple label, Britton Jane Homicide, 6 University Road, Cambridge, January 7, 1969. Inside were slides, photographs, and biological samples collected from her fur coat and bedsheets, material that earlier technology could never decode. But new sequencing techniques could now read what the human eye never could: microscopic fragments of DNA preserved by chance and cold. The lab team, led by forensic analyst Dr. Maya Kim, handled the evidence with reverence. To them, Jane wasn't just a file number. She was a story, one they could finally finish. Each slide was swabbed, rinsed, digitized. The machine hummed under soft fluorescent light. Hours passed. Then, somewhere between data lines and molecular signatures, a partial male DNA profile appeared. Not enough to name a killer, but enough to search. The profile was entered into the National Codes database. No hits. Dr. Kim didn't stop. She uploaded it to a new kind of tool, a genealogical database, used to match crime scene DNA with distant relatives of potential suspects. The idea was simple but revolutionary. If the killer was gone, his family's genes might still be here. The algorithm churned for days, comparing the 1969 sequence against thousands of modern entries. When the alert finally came, it was a faint but undeniable connection. A family in Massachusetts, descendants of a man named Michael Sumter. Michael Sumter. The name didn't appear anywhere in the original Britton case file, but the archives told a story darker than anyone imagined. Born in Cambridge, 1947, a history of violence beginning in his teens. Convicted of assault in 1973. Paroled. Arrested again. Later linked to 2 sexual assaults in Boston during the 1970s. He died of cancer in prison in 2001. At the time of Jane's murder, he'd lived only blocks away from her apartment. He was 21, young, strong, unknown to her world of academia. He worked odd jobs. He was invisible in the neighborhood's hierarchy. And yet, he had been there in that same winter air on those same frozen streets. To confirm the link, investigators obtained a posthumous DNA sample from Sumter's preserved evidence in an unrelated case. When the sequences overlapped, the computer's verdict was clear. Match probability, 99.92%. Source of DNA consistent with Michael Sumter. The case that had haunted Massachusetts for half a century was finally solved. When authorities made the announcement, there were no flashing sirens this time. No reporters shouting questions. Just a press release, plain, understated, factual. The murder of Jane Britton has been solved through DNA evidence. The perpetrator, Michael Sumter, is deceased. Her surviving brother, Reverend Boyd Britton, was 72 years old when he heard the news. He paused before speaking to journalists. His words were simple. "I don't know if you can call it closure, but at least now, she isn't just a question mark anymore." To him, the discovery wasn't about vengeance. It was about peace. A long-delayed acknowledgement that truth still exists, even buried under time. For investigators, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. Jane had spent her life unearthing the past, piecing together civilizations through the fragments they left behind. In the end, it was the fragments she left behind, microscopic, invisible, that unearthed her own story. Forensic scientists called it a poetic circle. Detectives who'd retired decades earlier called it a miracle. Dr. Kim called it something else. It's archaeology at the cellular level. We're still digging, just with smaller shovels. In the sterile hum of the crime lab, the world's noise fades. Somewhere, data flows into meaning, and from that meaning rises a whisper, one that says the dead don't always stay silent. They speak through what they leave behind. And sometimes, when the living finally listen, justice answers back. When the official statement was released, there were no flashing lights or breaking headlines. Just a quiet acknowledgement that one of Massachusetts' oldest unsolved murders had finally been explained. For most of the city, it was another news cycle. For the Britton family, it was an ending, the kind they'd stopped hoping for. Reverend Boyd Britton sat in a small study in New Hampshire when he got the call. 72 years old now. His voice had softened with age. His once dark hair turned silver. He listened in silence as the detective explained how DNA from a 55-year-old crime scene had matched a man long dead. When they finished, he said only, "Thank you for not forgetting her." Reporters reached out, asking if the family felt closure. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that holds both grief and gratitude. "Closure is a strange word," he said. "You don't close the memory of someone like Jane. You just learn to live beside it. But yes, it feels like she can rest now." For decades, Boyd had kept his sister's old letters, her childhood sketches, her watercolors of Persian ruins. When he looked at them now, he didn't see tragedy, he saw endurance. She had wanted to uncover lost civilizations. Instead, her own story had been the one buried and found. At the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab, Dr. Maya Kim gathered her team for a brief moment of silence after the confirmation. They'd solved hundreds of cases, but this one felt different. This wasn't just about science or success metrics. It was about a young woman who had once believed in the same pursuit of truth they lived by. On her desk, Dr. Kim kept a small photograph of Jane, the same one used in the 1969 newspaper. Her smile was faint, her eyes steady, as if she'd already known that one day, the tools she inspired would bring her story full circle. For every victim we remember, Dr. Kim said softly, there's a scientist decades from now who'll speak their name again. That's the real power of memory. Cambridge remembered Jane in its own quiet way. Harvard's anthropology department hosted a small lecture titled Ethics of Memory in Archaeology. At the end, a professor read her favorite quote from her field journal. We study the dead to understand the living, and in doing so, we promise them not to be forgotten. The apartment building at 6 University Road still stood, remodeled, repainted, renamed. Students passed its brick facade without a second glance. But beneath layers of paint and plaster, the original walls remained, the same ones that had once held that red dust. The dust had been mistaken for ritual, for mystery. In truth, it had been iron pigment from the walls, released by the struggle. Not a curse, not a ceremony, just a misunderstanding, one that shaped a legend. When the truth came out, journalists revisited old headlines. Harvard student slain in ancient burial rite. They corrected them. Cambridge cold case solved by DNA. But what they couldn't correct was the human impulse that had made people believe the myth for so long, the need for mystery when faced with tragedy. In the end, there had been no ritual, no scholar's secret, no curse from the ancient world. There had only been a man, a predator who saw an open window, and a brilliant young woman who trusted the safety of her world a little too much. Half a century later, technology had done what humanity couldn't. It remembered. The same field Jane loved, archaeology, had evolved into something smaller, sharper, and just as reverent. The tools that once unearthed bones now decoded the invisible. The brushes had become pipettes. The maps had become gene charts. But the purpose was the same, to bring the past to light. Forensic genealogy became the new archaeology. And through it, Jane Britton's life and death found meaning again. For 55 years, she was a name in the archives, a case number, a myth wrapped in dust. But the truth doesn't decay. It waits like fossils in the ground, like fingerprints in old air. Sometimes what we bury isn't gone. It just takes longer to find. Camera pans over Harvard's red brick buildings. Snow begins to fall again, just like it did that January morning in 1969. The same streets, the same air. Only now, the silence feels lighter, as though the city has exhaled at last. Jane Britton studied the dead to give them voices. Decades later, it was her turn to be heard. The red dust that once filled apartment 4B has long been washed away. The building stands quietly now. A new coat of paint, new tenants, new stories layered on top of old ones. But beneath its floorboards, the air still remembers. Every building does. They hold whispers in their walls, fragments of laughter, arguments, heartbreak, and sometimes the unsolved. Jane Britton's story could have ended in 1969. A bright student gone too soon. A case turned cold. A myth mistaken for mystery. But truth, like the past, has a way of enduring. Time is its own archaeologist. It digs through what we leave behind. Memories, evidence, myths, uncovering the truth grain by grain. For 55 years, the truth of Jane's death waited beneath the surface of rumor and misunderstanding. Then one strand of DNA, invisible to the naked eye, brushed away decades of dust. Science did what faith, fear, and folklore could not. It listened, and in doing so, it reminded the world that no story is truly lost, only waiting for the right hands to find it. Jane once wrote in her field journal, "We never really uncover the dead. We uncover ourselves, who we are, what we value, what we choose to remember." Those words became prophetic, because her story wasn't just about murder. It was about the human need to seek meaning, even in tragedy. It was about how we interpret silence, as mystery, as curse, or as a call to keep searching. And in the end, it was about connection, between the living and the dead, between a 23-year-old archaeologist and the scientists who, half a century later, carried her memory in a petri dish, between one family's grief and a world's progress. Across Massachusetts, the DNA breakthrough in the Britton case sparked something larger. Other unsolved murders from the 1960s were reopened. Families who had long buried their pain began receiving quiet phone calls. "We've found something." And though not every story ended with justice, every discovery carried Jane's legacy, a reminder that truth is patient. Harvard eventually honored her in a small but meaningful way. A scholarship for female archaeologists in her name. A single line on the plaque read, "For those who dig deeper in soil, in science, in truth." There are stories that end when the world stops talking about them. And there are stories that refuse to stay buried. Jane Britton's story belongs to the latter. She sought to uncover the ancient dead, never knowing that one day, she would be the one uncovered by the future she helped imagine. Camera pans across Harvard Yard at sunrise. The same buildings, the same city, but bathed in warm gold instead of icy gray. Snow melts along the edges of the brick paths. A new semester begins. Students rush past, carrying books, chasing deadlines, unaware that beneath their feet lies a century of stories still waiting to be told. History isn't made of dates and names. It's made of moments like this, when silence breaks, and a voice once lost becomes part of the living again. She studied the dead. Now she teaches the living, that truth always finds its way home. Some stories end with justice. The best ones end with remembrance. If the story moved you, subscribe for more true stories of resilience, of faith that outlives the silence, and of the human spirit that still believes, even when the world forgets.